Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm chatting with Fred Pouillot, the owner of cooking school Le Foodist, based in Paris's Latin Quarter. He's here to discuss a word that is essential to the French conception of regional food, wine, and more. Terroir. Welcome to the podcast, Fred. Fred, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what you do here in Paris?
Bonjour, Emily. Thank you for having me on the podcast. What I do in Paris is I live my passion, and I'm trying to help people discover French culture through food. And I do this. We built a school with Amanda, my wife, about 8 years ago now, I think. And it's called Le Foodist. And we give cooking classes with market visits. People cook a whole meal, and then we sit down, myself or chefs, and share stories about the culture relating to what we've prepared. And we do similar things with the pastry and tea times. That's the essence of what I do. We also take people sometimes for 1 week in Provence or in the Loire Valley to do the same thing, but a little bit deeper, and meet local producers and local chefs and spend a week getting to know a bit more about the local culture in different regions, which I guess would be different terroirs. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about this word terroir, and given your expertise and your experience and also this passion you have for French food and French culture, I think you're the ideal person to kind of open our eyes to this word. And it's one that I think some of our listeners are probably already familiar with, because in English we do use this word, but we tend to link it very specifically to wine. So my first question for you is, in your mind, is terroir first and foremost a wine word in French?
There are always multiple ways of looking at things. The short answer is no. Actually, I like to define terroir with our clients as terroir means what you do depends on where you are. What you do depends on where you are. And it could be anything you do, certainly in relation to food. So wine historically is a big contributor to the definition of terroir and its legalization, and we can go through that later. But it also applies to cheese, it applies to tea, it applies to actually animal productions, it applies to butter, cream, etc., etc. So it applies to anything that you can tie to a particular area, location, but the location is not even just the location physically, it's a location also culturally, and this interaction between the culture and the morphology of the location, and we can go more into the details of what that means, that actually creates the concept of terroir in my mind, and I believe in the mind of most French people.
Absolutely. So we have this idea of being rooted to a specific area, and that's something that you can see even etymologically in the word terroir with this T-E-R-R at the beginning, which is linked to the word terre in French. If you speak English and you've heard terracotta, that's cooked earth, T-E-R-R-A. So that idea of earth. But I really like what you're talking about it not just being linked to the soil or the climate or the specificity climate-wise of an area, but also being linked to the culture and the people who live there. I was reading something recently about how French people, in terms of their identity, are more likely to feel invested in their region's history and in their food rather than being, associated with like a local sports team, like we might in the States, where, you know, you're allied with your local sports team or your local state university sports team. And in France, there's this sort of craving of being identified with your region's culture and maybe the food as well. Does that ring true for you?
Actually, it's a revelation for me. What I mean by that is, yeah, it rings so true, but actually I'd never thought about sports and the relationship that certain cultures have to sports, in particular the British and the American culture versus the French culture. And you know, it's not like, you know, we don't play soccer in France, as the world would know, but it's true that what I found when I was living in America is I could not have a conversation with a male person for more than 10 minutes before they started switching to sports, which made the conversation short with me because I had zero interest in sports in terms of, just watching sports. And I do practice a bit of sport, but it's just talking about what people have done and scored and all that was never really interesting to me. But I never connected the dots because indeed when French people will sit down for a meal, depending on their age, they might have different types of conversations, but invariably, and you probably experienced that extensively have you been in France now for 15 years or something like that?
Yep, 15 years, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, well, whatever the conversation is, eventually it will move to food and we'll talk about food. We'll talk about what we've eaten, what we're eating, what we prepared and this recipe and et cetera, et cetera. And then with that comes obviously a notion of identity. The notion of identity is not a French thing. I think it's any culture. What we know is when people migrate to another country, within 2 or 3 generations at the most, they have totally forgotten the language of their grandparents. They are not able to communicate with them, but they are still eating the food of their grandparents. So food is a stronger marker of identity than actually language, and it's propagated over the generations. And so we have that strong identity, and I wonder what happens. I wonder what happens to English people when they move to another country in terms of how they eat after 3 generations. Because I don't know if they have a relationship to the specific, Heinz beans or things like that is so strong that they really have to have that 3 generations later. But, back to your topic, yes, it rings very true that we don't maybe have as much passion for the local sports team that we have for our local food in France. That rings very true.
Yeah, and it almost seems like there's this, because of the normalization, the standardization of the French language, because of the eradication to a large extent of the regional dialects, it does almost seem like not only, what you were saying, that rings so true about the food pervading through generations where the language is lost and maybe other customs, religious customs, dress customs are lost. But you have this idea where you can be from a region in France and move to Paris. And I think for our American listeners out there, I think that the French tend to be a little bit less mobile than the Americans do, but there is this sort of concentration of people from les provinces, the provinces, into Paris. Maybe they'll lose their accent, maybe they'll lose a lot of other traditions, but they will bring with them, this love of the specific cheese or the specific wine or the specific charcuterie that comes from the region that they come from.
Yes, I actually love where you're taking this.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, because all right, going deep now. There is a national narrative in France, right? Mm-hmm. And that national narrative has to do, obviously, with the definition of who the enemies are outside the border. But actually, a lot of what France is about is the assimilation of the people who live in the territory known today as France by the people today known as the Parisians. And the construction of France, to me, but it's not just to me, starts basically with Philippe Auguste started conquering the rest of the territory known as France. Philippe Auguste is effectively a king of Paris and the surrounding area, the Ile-de-France, the island of France, and then goes on conquer everything else. And that started...
And we're talking 11th century now?
1200s. So
1200s,
yeah.
Okay.
So he did that from 1180 to 1235. And so the construction has continued. Louis XIV is probably much more known to your audience with Versailles. And Versailles is about actually also centralizing power. It's actually an interesting thing happens in Versailles, which is to bring all the people that have power in France into one location, to control them, to remove them actually from where they are from. So Louis XIV can run his administration and collect the taxes effectively. As a result of that, and that's a side note, and I don't want to talk about this, but because you have a lot of people in Versailles, it's an okay town, but you can imagine how boring it was 300 years ago, and people have nothing to do, so they have a lot of money, not so much to do. How about eating a lot? And I think this is actually one of the reasons why French gastronomy started departing from other gastronomies, because there was such a concentration of high demand for high-end food in one location with a lot of people. In the same way that demand drives the evolution of refined food around the world over the past 30 years. But it's a completely different topic. More importantly, the French territory was always indeed assimilated by the Parisian aristocracy, which became the Parisian elite after the French Revolution. But by 1870, I believe there's a book by a guy called Antoine Weber, and I think it's called Les Terroirs Français. It could be Les Territoires Français, but there's such an overlap in the concept. And he's saying that more than 50% of the French people did not speak French at that time. So 1870, 50% or more of the French people did not speak a word of French. And it's exactly what you're saying, right? That assimilation, that indoctrination in building the French national novel, le roman national, happens with mandatory schooling and finding a common enemy, and that common enemy is Germany. So we have a first war with them, and we lose it in 1871, and then we basically spend the following 43 years blaming the Germans for everything so that we can go back to war with them in 1914. Okay. And then we do it again. And then it's the other way around. It's 1939 because of the consequence of the first one. But that process of assimilation of the French also was predicated on recognizing the differences of the French people. And as we took away their culture, their language, we gave them back their authenticity in the products that they were producing there. And I don't think it's by chance that the time when the Appellation d'origine law, the first one, was promulgated is 1905. It's 1905 also in France when we decide that we officially separate the state from the church. 1905 is really an emergence of the Republic as we're going to know it throughout the 20th century. And it's all those things that are actually being recognized, like, well, you are French now, you are fodder for the army, you will defend our borders, and you will speak French, you will not speak your local language, but you will be able to claim your identity by eating your local produce, be it sausages, be it cheeses, be it wines. In 1905, it's actually all produce. Later, we actually refined the concept of the appellation d'origine, the denomination origin for protection, and extended or actually refined it to wine. But the two are completely related. The notion of, yes, local identity and local products. And it was kind of a trade-off to leave, to keep the French people happy, that the Parisians gave them. It's like, you speak our language and you can keep your produce, and we're going to chant the beauty and the originality of your produce.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. You've touched on so many things that we definitely need to circle back to, especially this idea of the appellation d'origine, which is the AOC, AOP labels that you see on wine that we use to protect a lot of our local products here in France. But before we even delve into that, one other thing that you were talking about with this period of, late 19th into the early 20th century, when you were talking about the French novel, the roman français, I think about this idea of like the imagination of concocting a history after the fact. And you look at Napoleon III, who's the nephew of Napoleon I. He becomes the emperor during the Second Empire. I mean, he's this person who creates this mythology around the Gauls, the Gaulish people, Vercingétorix and all of this, to give the French this idea that they have one unified national history, which, as I'm sure you know, is far from the reality. You have all of these different peoples who are not necessarily all descended from Vercingétorix, but it gives people this idea that they all lay claim to this one common history. And I'm sure it facilitates a lot of the things that you're talking about with the unification of the French under one language, with the republicanization of schools, with the separation of church and state, and the idea that we're all going to be allied in our minds to the republic, not to the church, not to the king, not to anything else.
I'm going to actually build on what you say about Vercingétorix, which my experience of the people who come to us, most of them have never heard of Vercingétorix. So just to give some context, is the person who was fighting Caesar in the territory today known as France. So everybody has heard of Caesar. Well, his enemy in France was Vercingétorix, and he tried to rally a number of tribes. The most famous, probably the Parisi, that got decimated under the Field of Mars, under the Eiffel Tower today. But anyway, the point of this Vercingétorix being chosen and the Gaulish warrior being chosen by Napoleon III as our common ancestor, I always find very interesting. Because the reason why we picked the Gaulish warriors, people need to understand that before 1870 in France, our common ancestor were the Romans. Okay. The issue with the Romans was that the Romans were associated with the Roman Catholic Church. And so the left in France did not want an ancestor or an ancestry, if you will, that would be related to religion. The right in France wanted an ancestry that would be related to the soil, because the right-wing people are always more associated with locality, a lot less international. And so the right wanted something related to where we are, and the left didn't want anything to do with the Romans. And the solution was to go before the Romans in France, and that's where they came up with the idea of the Gaulish warriors. And then the mythology was created of, all the battles and all that.
That is fascinating. And so then we're back in this idea of the earth. And this brings us to the other element of this that you were mentioning, which is, of course, the first protected appellations. And so in France, we love rules, we love paperwork, we love bureaucracy, and we love normalizing things with systems. And so we sort of, 1905, you created this system to essentially begin to protect some of these regional specificities as pertains to food. Can you tell me a little bit about why you think this was the point when we started to almost legislate on this?
Well, my understanding is that indeed it was the beginning of a legislative process that has been going on ever since. At the time, there was a lot of fraud in the wine industry in particular. People could claim that things were coming from a certain region, even though it was not coming from the region, because the region had a certain fame. And so people decided to focus on that, but it was not just wine. Appellation d'origine was actually for many, many things. And as a matter of fact, the first protected designation of origin, I think that's how you said in English for the AOP, was actually given in 1925 to a cheese, which is Roquefort. At first, it was designation of origin. Yeah, it comes from there. And that's all it was. It comes from there, and you can't claim it comes from there if it doesn't come from an area that everybody understands to be there. For example, if you're going to sell a Roquefort cheese, it has to be made in the area around the town of Roquefort. That's more or less how it was defined. Champagne, will have to be made in an area that today is known as Champagne, but was not necessarily known as clearly as Champagne at the time, etc., etc. What was missing in that denomination or designation of origin was the concept of quality. And they had to refine the concept, and the wine industry in particular, especially the ones that were making a lot of money on wine, so think Bordeaux and Burgundy, were pushing a lot on the concept that it needed to be also with a certain tasting criteria by the people from the region to validate that the production would be at the right level of quality before it could be also protected by that label of designation of origin. Okay. And there was also designation of origin, and then protection of the designation of origin came with a number of criteria. And I think that was around 1935.
Okay.
So it took steps. And while the wine industry was involved, they were not heard completely by the ministry. And I think this is when they created what is called in French, INAO, Institut National des Appellations d'Origine, which actually now has renamed itself, but I kept the acronym, which is very French, I guess. Doesn't make any sense. They call themselves National Institute for Quality, and it's still called INAO. It's like, well, where's the Q in the acronym of your name? And I had a big debate with a lady once at a cheesemonger because she worked for INAO. And I was explaining to somebody else, INAO means Institut National des Appellations d'Origine. And she's like, no. It means Institut National Supérieur de la Qualité, something like that. It's like, well, no, it doesn't. INAO means this. Now, maybe your company has changed its name, but that's what INAO stands for. Anyway, more importantly, the French decided to appoint a body because, as you say, we love administration and regulations and rules. And so they said, see, if we want to protect people, we need to have people who produce certain things. We need to also have a body that's going to regulate how those things are done, and is going to register how people want to be protected and for what they want to be protected. And so there was an obligation of being from a certain region. There is an obligation of having a certain output quality that will be tested and validated by local producers, recognized from being from the region. And then many of them added a spec, if you will, which was how the stuff had to be made in the first place. So what were the inputs to the process? And when they had those three dimensions, the input, the output, and the area where it could actually be claimed, then this is really when the whole system of protected designation of origin came together. And that evolved through the 20th century to be more and more refined, including the way you could basically legislate against it, the way you could sue people, etc., until the concept was adopted by Europe, and it became not a French concept, but it became a European concept. The Italians had a similar concept created in the 1960s. The Spaniards had also a similar concept, and all of that merged together. And I think it's by 1990, around that time, that they created the actual protected designation of origin, because in French it would have been controlled designation of origin. It was AOC, as you just said earlier, instead of the AOP. And I think by now, it's relatively recent, the AOP system is the one that is recognized everywhere in Europe. Only the French wines were still allowed to keep that AOC label until maybe 2015 or 2018, something like that, because they were so attached to the AOC. But I think now AOC is just a step to get to the AOP, which is a European version. To me, it's the testament of the French leadership on food. Just laughing when I'm saying that. That actually this designation of, or protected designation of origin has now a broad base of support in Europe and actually in a few other countries, but of course not in America, as you can imagine.
No, of course not.
So that, I mean, I don't know if I really answered your question about the legislation. But...
No, you absolutely did. So today we have, yes, like as you were saying, we have both a little bit of this carryover of AOC. So if you pick up a wine bottle and you see, AOC Bordeaux or AOC Languedoc, that is that French designation. Then we have AOP as well. And under this sort of AOC, AOP umbrella, in France, we've protected about, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but we have about 400 wine regions, things like Champagne, Bordeaux, Saint-Emilion, Sancerre. We have 46, I believe, cheeses that are protected, 4 butters, a couple of hams, a walnut, a lentil. Like, we've protected quite a few very specific regional products.
Yep.
Using this label. So it's far, far from just being a question of, oh, you can't call this sparkling Chardonnay champagne because you made it in California. You have to make it in Champagne to call it champagne. So it's much more than just that. You can't do this. It's about protecting local know-how, local history, local culture, and also this actual tradition of, for example, the one lentil that I mentioned, which always makes people laugh, is a lentil that grows in the volcanic soil of central France in the region called the Auvergne. And if you grow that same variety of lentil in a non-volcanic soil, you can't call it the Puy lentil because it's not going to take on that local richness
flavor.
Of the soil. Yeah, the flavor.
What you're saying is very important because a lot of people associate and know terroir first through wine. And as you said, there are about 400 wines in France that have terroir, and it's not always clear for people the concept outside of France. I know that from first experience because I was in the UK. Amanda being British, we go there often, and they've started making a wine that, if it were made in Champagne, would be called Champagne, but because it's not made in the Champagne region, let's call it a bubbly or a méthode champenoise, so Champagne-style wine, but made outside of the region. And it's very good. And in total objectivity, the British have decided it is the best champagne in the world. So I decided to go taste it. It's actually quite affordable. And I went to the winery where they make it. The lady that welcomed us in the shop, it was a shop, was explaining quite a few things. So she seems quite articulate. So I asked her, I said, okay, so where do the grapes come from that you're using for making that champagne or wine? And she looked at me with a blank face and she just could not understand the question.
Wow.
And it was kind of a double take for me because is it in a slopey area, a certain type of grape? What's the story of the grape, basically? And that was not part of our training. Our training was the different products that they were setting, basically. And that was a bit of a shock for me, and a realization that, the concept of terroir is something that is totally natural to Italians, Spaniards, probably Portuguese. I don't know that from first-hand experience, but I'm pretty sure. And there's so much interaction between the French and the Portuguese culture anyway that, even if it's not natural to them by now, it is. And then to the French. When you go outside and further north, I'm not sure how natural the concept actually is. But even French people will think terroir is the soil. and they'll think wine, the soil, is a bit of a mystique or magic, that it's like you will have in a certain soil a certain thing that you will find back into your wine. And that's not really the way it works. What is important about the soil is it's, in particular in the case of wine, is its hydration capability, so its ability to move water and absorb water, retain water, and also its ability to absorb and give heat back. Okay, because the amount of water a vine is going to get and the amount of heat is going to get during the day, during the night, and the variation between the day and night is actually what's going to determine your ability to grow certain vines and have certain types of grapes and turn them into, something wonderful. That's the kind of the physical dimension of it. But there's another physical dimension of it, which is the level of sun you're going to get, right? The sun is obviously very important on developing, anything that has water with a little bit of heat. And so if you have a different slope, you have the air that actually flows at night from the top of that hill or that mountain and goes down to the bottom, rolls down the bottom. That profile of the wind coming down every night would actually confer a way for the grapes to see heat differentials throughout the night that would be very different than if you're on a flat land, for example. Okay. And if you're orientated to the south, you're going to have a very different exposure to the sun, and the soil is going to heat up in a very different way that you have something facing north. So when you actually go into places, for example, Chablis, which I think people have heard of Chablis, and maybe it doesn't have that actually the connotation it deserves in America, because for some reason it became a term, I think, associated with some form of mass production. But Chablis wines are, wonderful Chardonnay, but they're a lot more what we say mineral than the Chardonnays you'll find in the rest of Burgundy. But it's a Burgundy wine. As you go to Chablis, you have different denomination or designation of protected origin, and they go by Petit Chablis, the small Chablis, Chablis Grand Cru, Chablis Premier Cru. And all of those correspond to particular pieces of soil, land, that have been designated by the producers together. And they agree that if you do a wine on this particular slope of this particular hill, then you're allowed to call your wine a Grand Cru. But if you do it on the other side of the slope, it's just a regular Chablis. And if you do it in another area of the town, it would be called Petit Chablis. And that is not changing ever. It's not going to change next year or the year after, whatever, because these people have been doing this for literally hundreds of years. They've come to an agreement about 100 years ago, and they said, these are the best, what we call parcelles. So they are the best pieces of soil. And when they say soil, they don't mean just soil, what is in the ground. They mean soil and exposition to the sun and the way the wind goes down. And all of those combinations make it possible for you to do a much better growth. That's what cru means, a much better growth than if you did it 500 meters away on the other side of the hill. And that concept is very hard for people to understand. I think if you don't start understanding how things grow in nature and how they depend on water and heat, okay? And anybody who's got a greenhouse understands how heat has a huge impact on how things grow. And anybody who waters plants knows that, water and heat is basically, these are the key determinants of how you're going to grow things, how quickly you're going to grow them or not. And so the other dimension that comes into this is, what kind of grape do you need to plant in what kind of area? Because if you have a certain climate, a certain soil, and a certain profile of temperature during the day, during the night, during the year, certain grapes are going to do very well and others are not going to do so well. So as a result, whole regions that live in the same kind of area and have the kind of same exposition to climate tend to plant the same grapes in France. And that has become part of the concept of a protected designation of origin. And for example, in Burgundy, everybody that does red wine is Pinot Noir, and they can't do anything else because they found that this is a grape that works well in that particular region and area overall. But then different parcel will give you different wines, and they will cut the leaves differently so that they protect and they shade the grapes differently. And some of them have this very, very privileged combination of factors, which might or might not be real. But as a result, with this concept of protected designation of origin, and I think that betrays maybe its marketing nature, we're able to sell bottles of wine to people for 25,000 euros a bottle. And I kid you not. I mean, the French who've been doing this for 1,000 years, we've become so good at marketing wine that we can actually sell Domaine de la Romanée-Conti 25,000 euros a bottle. And you can't even really buy it on its own. You have to buy several others in order to be able to get that bottle.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's the physics of it, and then there is the human nature of it, because obviously what La Romanée-Conti does is not just have planted Pinot Noir in a particular area. They also know how to transform that grape based on what they get from the weather, because nobody controls the weather. But what you can control is how you lead the maturation of your grapes through the period. You can decide that if you don't have the right conditions, you're actually going to reduce the production so that the few grapes you're going to have are still going to have enough intensity, if you will, to transform them into great wine. And then you're going to pick them by hand. You're not going to pick them with a machine, so that you can pick the grapes exactly when they're ripe. All fruits, including grapes, have an optimum moment where you can actually pick them. That includes prunes, that includes all these things. Most people don't know that, because by the time you get them on the shelf in the supermarket, they've been picked at the wrong time, actually underripe, so they can be transported and they are ripened later. And as a result, we wonder why they don't taste like anything. Well, there's a good reason. We actually pick them so that they will not taste like anything, because we wanted to transport them rather than actually make them taste good. That's why the local movement is interesting, because it might help us reconnect to a true flavor, because you don't have those issues of transportation. But we're going sideways. Going back to the grape, the grape is actually a fruit. So, and all the moment you pick, how you grow it, how you master basically the evolution of the grape, that's a human factor. And that's where terroir is becoming very interesting, because it's a combination of the soil, the climate, and the people, and the produce itself that you're actually growing and transforming. And that's interaction in those 4 dimensions that is actually determining what a terroir is. And now you start understanding that you take somebody from Bordeaux and you put them in a field in Burgundy, and you put them in Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, even if they come from one of the best ones of Bordeaux, if they don't get the experience from the person who's been doing this for the past 20, 30, 40 years, they will not produce the same thing as that person who's actually learned how to grow specifically Pinot Noir in that particular parcel.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. And I think through all of this, you've actually shown something that's another really essential element of terroir in France. It might be a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario as to, is this why the French are so hyper aware of their terroir? You know, which one came first? But the fact that France, as compared to so many other European countries, has such a huge variety of soils and climates and weather conditions. And I remember Lucien Lefebvre did a map of France that divided France into 4 sections based on what kind of cooking fat was used in each area. You know, you have butter, olive oil, duck fat, and one other one that I can't remember. Maybe it was pork fat or beef tallow or something like that.
Beef tallow. Actually, it was beef tallow.
Beef tallow. And already just when you look at France like that as a country that can be divided based on what kind of cooking fat it's using, it sort of shows you that A, what's locally available, and B, the culture and the way that people have maybe become inspired by, I don't know, by the Germans to the east, or, you know, what's locally available is going to dictate what happens there. And what happens there is going to then dictate what they want to make more locally available. So it feeds into itself.
Yeah, it could be a virtuous circle. Absolutely.
Exactly.
What's nice about that is because we are all human, so most of us love to eat and enjoy food. People with what they have at their mean, you know, have been able to develop those local recipes that are just grateful using those local products. And they've had quite a few hundred years to do that. So
exactly.
So the result is yes, interesting.
And the average French person seems to me to be far more sensitive to that culture and history and longevity than the average Brit or American. Like, I remember I had this friend, Kristen Beddard, who she moved from the United States to France. She was living here. She realized as she was going to the local markets, this was 2010, maybe 2012, that there was no kale on the French market stands. She was like, that's really odd. And she started asking a bunch of people, you know, kale. And they said, oh, Savoy cabbage. Is this what you want? No, that's not what I want. Oh, you know, blette, Swiss chard. Is this what you want? No, this isn't what I want. And she started to do some research and found that kale did appear on like drawings of French vegetables pre-World War II, and then it was kind of eradicated. And what she discovered was that it was a member of this group of the légumes oubliés, the forgotten vegetables that the French ate so much of during the war period that they kind of forgot about the things like Jerusalem artichokes and rutabaga and things like that. And she tried to get farmers to start growing it, telling them, oh, you know, it's so good for you. It's rich in vitamin K. It's really healthy. And they were like, yeah, that's fine. We don't really care. But when she told them about the history and that the fact that it was something that had existed in France that was then eradicated, that was the thing that sparked their interest in sort of replanting it and rediscovering it. They didn't care the way that we do in America, that it's like, oh, it's a super green, it's a superfood, it's really good for you. They cared that it had this pre-existing linked to their history and to their terroir. Do you think that maybe history is more important to the French than the health benefits of a food?
I find it fascinating. Yeah. What you just said. I didn't know. I knew somebody actually had, and it was an American lady. I knew somebody had been trying to push the revival of kale with success, because we can find kale actually in quite a few places now in France. French markets, but I didn't realize that she'd been able to turn the producers based on the history, but I'm totally not surprised. It does make perfect sense to me. I think this is my interpretation. I am not sure this is exactly what people think, but I think if I told them that, they would agree. Tradition has developed certain patterns of eating, so accessing food and procuring food, transforming food, and then eating food. And I include the process of eating food as part of all this, because I do believe that the way we eat is cultural, but it's also very important to the aspect you talked about, which is the health, which seems to be indeed a very important criteria for the Anglo-Saxon eater, the health dimension. For the French, under the influence actually of the Anglo-Saxon culture, I think it's becoming a bit more of a concern. But the idea is that, for example, if you go to North Africa, people eat couscous and chickpeas, okay? And you have beans and rice in Central South America, etc. You have those combinations, and the idea, which actually is not totally funded into science, but the idea is you find in those combinations of grains and legumes all the elements you need to have all the proteins building tools that you would not get unless you ate meat. So in these regions where there was not so much money and not necessarily always access to meat, people developed a solution for their health, the fundamental of their health, which is access to proteins. Okay. And it's a completely different topic, but access to proteins is basically what drives the diets of all living animals, including humans. And so they found the solutions and they institutionalized, if you will, the solution by actually simply surviving. Okay. The ones who did not eat those diets probably just died away. The ones who ate those diets survived and thrived. And so those diets became the traditional regional diets in all those places. The same, I think, is true in France. In the perception we have is like in a lot of regions, people have been eating the same way for a long time, not always as long as they think, right? Because there were no potatoes to eat in France 400 years ago, right? So people eat a lot of potatoes and it's traditional. It's only traditional for so many years, so many hundreds of years. Then what they will tell you is like, well, you might never find the silver bullet, the solution to your health problem. But if you have a balanced diet that you've been eating, which is the same as your parents, the same as your grandparents, and the same as 2 or 3 generations before, and it's worked for them, there's no reason why it would not work for you. So you can forever look for the ultimate answer or solution, health benefit of one particular item. But having a personal passion for nutrition, I can tell you that I don't know anybody who can truly explain to you what really happens to food from the time it goes into your mouth to the time it disappears one way or the other. I mean, it's extremely, extremely complex, and certainly trying to isolate one element to understand that one element as a key benefit is missing the whole point of what nutrition and symbiosis and all the interactions that are happening actually are. So there is a notion that, you can aim for that one particular benefit, but as a French, we don't think you'll get there. Or you can go for something that has been tested, if you will, and vetted by many generations as being healthy. And you probably heard of the French paradox, the French paradox, when they did those dietary studies and they found that people in the southwest of France who supposedly eat a lot of, fat because of foie gras and drink a lot of wine and were actually having less cardiovascular diseases than any other region in Europe. And there has been, I don't know how many tens of theories as to why that might be the case since then. I'm not sure anybody nailed it. But the idea is, well, if you kind of live like they do, eat like they do, and eat what they do, chances are the same health benefit will come to you as came to them. The problem is nobody's really doing that. People are doing that and different things. So people eat all the traditional stuff and then they add maybe soda like a Coca-Cola and they start adding dessert at the end of the meal, which we never really did in France until very recently. So you start putting sugar on top of the traditional diet and then everything goes astray. But that's altogether another conversation.
Once again, we're coming back to this sort of like tradition, these pervasive culinary choices that have been made in the same area over time for a very, very long time. And we do have in France, and again, we're re-centralizing back to Paris, we have this event that happens every year that I think that as a cultural outsider, when you examine it, it is fascinating. So it's an event called the Salon de l'Agriculture. So it's a professional sort of trade fair that happens in Paris once a year, where you have regional producers and farmers bringing not just products, but actual farm animals into Paris for, I believe it's a week and a half. And one critical test of a potential or currently sitting president is to see how long he can last or how he interacts. I say he because so far we've only had he, but how he interacts with the producers and the farmers. Can you tell me a little bit, as a cultural insider yourself, what the Salon de l'Agriculture actually means to the average French person and to sort of French society? Why is this so important?
It's a good question because I hate to tell you that, but it has never fascinated me. But I will tell you why I think it fascinates the average French person is because in the average French psyche, we are still perceiving ourselves as a land of farmers. The story goes that probably 2 generations ago, my grandparents' generation, so 3 generations ago for you, everybody in France had a direct connection to the land. And they had somebody in their family or somebody they knew very well that was a farmer. Whether it was true or not, I don't think it was actually, because urbanization actually did start through the 20th century. It didn't happen over the past just 20 years. But until what we call the démembrement, where in the 1960s, basically end of World War II, a lot of push to rationalize agriculture in France was made. And I would say that companies like John Deere were not complete strangers to all of this, because there was a big push to sell a lot of products, a lot of tractors and farming equipment, etc., which in France was a big market in terms of landmass. I mean, France territory is about, I believe, 5 to 6 times the size of Angleterre, and a lot of farmers, so a lot of business opportunities needed to be tapped into, but it was impossible because people had lots of small parcels that were here and there, and they would go from one to the other with their horse and try to work their soil that way. And the French government said, we're going to be done with all this. We're going to reorganize all the parcels so people can be in big pieces of land that they can farm much more effectively. And effectively means instead of having human farming the land, we're going to have capital farming the land. Okay. And so we went from an economy that was with people that became an economy with machines, more like the American model. As that happened, a lot of farmers got out of a job because they were basically bought out so that they would move away, and their kids didn't have a job anymore and they moved into the cities. Okay. So that big so-called exode rural happened big time in the 60s and 70s. So after that, I think since the proportion of farmers in France decreased dramatically and the productivity obviously increased dramatically, the quantity of food produced per farmer, I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but probably increased between 5 and 10-fold between 1960 and 2000 per farmer. I'm not talking yield per surface, I'm talking per farmer. And as a result, we lost our connection, if you will, to the land and to those farmers. And I think the salon d'agriculture plays a role in the mythology of, France being a land of farmers by bringing those farmers in a display to the Parisians, making that grand mass of connection between Paris and the land. And it's kind of a representation that to me is maintaining a bit of mythology. That's how I perceive the salon d'agriculture. I am not sure you will find many French people who agree with me, but that's my read on it.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Fred, it's always so fascinating to talk to you about these topics. And for anyone listening out there who wants to learn even more about how we eat in France and why we eat the way we do in France, I highly recommend paying Fred's cooking school a visit. It's in Paris in the Latin Quarter. It's called Le Foodist, L-E and then space F-O-O-D-I-S-T, but we'll put a link in the description for the podcast. So you do market cooking classes, you do pastry and bread cooking classes, you do wine and cheese pairings in this beautiful setting right in the heart of Paris. So anyone listening who wants to give that a try, please feel free to reach out. And I only have one last question for you, Fred, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Ooh la la. Ooh la la is not my favorite word, by the way. I will surprise you. I would say probably my favorite word is oui. Voilà.
Oh.
Oui means something in French and something in English. And I like what it means in both languages. So there you go. I would say oui.
Love that. Well, thank you very, very much for joining me. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.
It's been a real pleasure, Emily. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.